Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gateway Spotlight series. I'm your host, Brooke Roberts. Today's Spotlight is brought to you by the Spanish Institute for Global Education. The Institute this is based in Seville, Spain, and it offers study abroad programs, custom programs for college, high school, and adult learners, and advanced training in teaching Spanish and second language acquisition, which is great for our subject matter today. With broad networks for internships, service learning, research, family stays, and more, and over 40 years of experience, the Institute taps the richest of Andalusia. You can learn more about the Spanish Institute for Global Education at SpanishInstitute.net. And their tagline is all about up close and personal in Seville, immersive, attentive, and transformational. So thank you so much for sponsoring today's episode. I'm really pleased to be talking about today's topic and with our amazing guest. I'm just going to pull up that information real quick. I just lost it, everybody. Here we go. So today we're going to be talking about language learning, and we're kind of shifting gears because the last few episodes we've really talked about technology and the new frontiers of what's happening in the virtual and remote spaces of global education. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit and bring it back to kind of some of the fundamentals and foundational elements of what we do in international education. So today we're going to be talking about language learning. And so language learning abroad was once an essential component of most education abroad experiences. It's sort of that classic thing, you're going to go abroad and learn a language. But with the rise of the center model, or we could also call them island programs perhaps, with all of the classes being taught in English, and more universities around the world offering courses and full degree programs in English, even if that's not the native language of the local community. The motivation and the necessity for US students to learn a foreign language has seemed to decline a little bit. So in this episode, we're going to be talking with Katharine E. Burns, otherwise known as Katie. She's an assistant professor of second language acquisition and Hispanic studies at Carnegie Mellon University. And we're going to be talking about the current trends in language learning and research that she's been doing on this space and what's happening in her expertise and arena. And also looking at innovative ways programs around the world are helping students become bilingual through study abroad. We're also going to discuss why language learning is still a critical skill needed in the digital age, even with all the technology hacks and things we can have that make it easier to not know a foreign language. So thank you so much for being here, Katie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Great. So we had sort of a pre-conversation a few weeks ago, and so I'm really excited for you to share a little bit more about your work. And you blew my mind with so many cool things and the research that's coming out about language acquisition. And we're going to get in that to a second. But before we go there, why don't we learn a little bit about you and how your sort of what I call your international ed story, but just how you got fascinated with languages and intercultural experiences, and and then became a researcher and PhD in this specific area.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for me, like for many of my colleagues, it is a love story at root. So, initially I took a foreign language course. I chose Spanish and just fell in love with it. I found that I enjoyed it and had something of an aptitude for it. And so I just kept going and taking the next level, until I got to the university and decided to do a major in Spanish. And I wasn't able to actually do the traditional study abroad sort of undergraduate second, third year semester or summer abroad. And so I had to kind of find ways to get international experiences that may be considered non-traditional. And I know that's something that more and more students are doing. And so I found ways as a graduate student and later on in life to have experiences abroad in Spanish-speaking countries and also in non-Spanish-speaking countries. But really, in terms of getting into my job and my research, it was the power of one particular mentor and professor during my master's degree in Spanish, Professor Todd Hernandez at Marquette University. So those of us who are educators should not underestimate our potential to really influence the trajectory of someone's life. I didn't know that applied linguistics existed as a field really until I took a course from him on second language acquisition and just realized this is what I've been waiting for. And so with his mentorship, I was able to find the PhD program at the University of Arizona and do the PhD and start my career. And in
That's
terms
really
of,
cool. Go ahead.
yeah, in
Yeah.
terms of just a quick rundown of my research. So I focus on bilingual and heritage speaker identity formation, and kind of within that language ideologies, and language policy and planning, as well as kind of the ways that Spanish is used and taught in the United States and learned in the United States as well.
Cool. So, well, I really want to capitalize on the fact that you're at Carnegie Mellon, which is, a world-renowned science, engineering, focused institution. Of course, there's other things there, obviously, but that's what it's bread and butter. That's what it's known for. And when we talked before, we talked a little bit about some of the parallels of this idea of learning the language of code and also the language of communication, the traditional way we would describe that. What are some of those parallels, and what have you found in terms of bringing your work to a campus like that and a student population at Carnegie Mellon, in terms of this second language acquisition process, but also their mindset around coding as a language?
Yes, so it's such an exciting place to work in that sense. So yes, Carnegie Mellon is world famous for its STEM research and teaching, which is top notch. We also have a lot of really amazing programs in the arts that are also world renowned. So for example, we have connections to CODA that recently won an Emmy. So our students are actually very well rounded when they come to us, and they have a lot of passions and talents in all areas. They're also very funny. But what's so interesting for me as someone who's interested in language policy, I was seeing some bills being passed in places like Florida and elsewhere, and different policies happening around counting computer coding languages as foreign language credits. So either for high school graduation or in some cases for entrance into state public universities. And I was fascinated by that because as a language educator, I kind of had my hackles up like, whoa, wait a minute, you can't count Python or C++ in place of French or Spanish. But because my students have, many of them, a lot of technical expertise, and many also come to us as bilinguals. So whether that's because they're international students or because they're heritage speakers or because they may have learned a language in a sequential format, they have the unique experience of being really proficient coders, and many of them are, sort of human language bilinguals. So we've had many interesting discussions in class, and it is most of them say is that there are certain parallels. So for example, coding languages have syntax, they operate under logic. There are certain, sentences or sequences, let's say, that are illegal in the same way that we might have grammatical parameters. And they've talked about the ways in which coding languages may also have some degree of professional culture attached to them. But most of them, and in particularly interesting to me, the ones that are themselves bilinguals, in a human sense, are very quick to say that they do not believe that a user of, let's say, English and Python can claim bilingualism. And that's because of what many of us already know, which is the vast cultural and human component that a language learning opens up the door to really understanding ourselves as humans better, and to understanding the kind of limits and boundaries and different ways of organizing thought, and to, a line I really love from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is that, this is a paraphrase, but it's something like grammar is the way we map relationships. And so the ways that different languages have done that, and it's just one small example of something like that. But for them, I notice in the United States, for a lot of L2 students, their motivations are around understanding culture better, and that really drives them. So that is one big thing missing from trying to create a parallel between coding languages and L2s. And I think in the world we live in which, many groups are really misunderstanding each other, and communication seems to be breaking down between different cultures, that's arguably more important than ever.
Yeah, I just want to ask the audience, for those of you who are tuning in live today, if you would share in the chat, if you would describe yourself as maybe a heritage speaker, a someone who is bilingual, multilingual, perhaps. Or if you're like, nah, I know a little bit, but I would not describe myself as those things, maybe your level at a specific language. I'd just love to know who's in the room. You might be like me, where you've studied like 6 languages and you're just horrible at all of them. That's my story with language. But I didn't have a great professor who like encouraged me either. So maybe that I needed to come to your classes. So let's talk a little bit, especially those of us who are not, we don't teach language. We're not scholars in this arena. Can you give us a top line understanding of what was the quote old way of teaching language or bringing people into the language acquisition world fold in terms of learning a new language, and then we'll get into sort of some new philosophies, I guess, or approaches that people in your arena and the new research that's coming out around language acquisition. So what's the old way?
Yeah, so this is a big question. There are lots of ways I could answer it. If we think back to kind of mid 20th century or even earlier than that, it was a lot of it was inspired by behaviorism in psychology. So a lot of repetition, a lot of, practice makes perfect, but the practice also has to be perfect. So repeat after me, language labs with headphones,
Yes.
dialogues, excuse me. So, memorizing dialogues, that kind of stuff. And then sort of in the later 20th century, there was a turn towards focusing more on communication. So worrying less about perfect grammar and perfect pronunciation and focusing more on, can I get my point across? So that would be communicative language teaching. Many of us are familiar with that. That isn't to say that some of those older techniques have completely disappeared. So there is, it's sort of, when we think about old and new, it's all sort of together in the sense that some techniques that might be considered old are still used, and there may be good reason for that. But I think what's exciting now too is that even pushing beyond the focus on communication is we're starting to, many of my colleagues and I are starting to think more about learners, L2 learners, second language learners as, emerging bilinguals. So rather than having a separation between something like second language education and bilingual education, if the goal of second language acquisition is to produce bilinguals, what can we take from more traditional bilingual education, by which I mean sort of right from from kindergarten or the K-12 sphere, students who are already coming bilingual or creating childhood bilinguals? What lessons can we take from the way bilinguals use languages and think about themselves and try to apply those to the kind of traditional models for adult second language learning at the kind of high school or university level?
Okay, so can you unpack that a little bit? What would be an
Sure.
example of something? Because I'm fascinated by this, but I'm like, okay, how would that look in real life, in a classroom today? So what's an example of something that maybe at the K through 12 level that they're doing in the bilingual world, and how could we leverage that in the L2 world, if you will?
Yeah, so I think, and sometimes this is referred to as the multilingual turn. So trying to
Okay.
see language, all of our language resources. So sometimes the word repertoire gets used if you're familiar with the translanguaging paradigms, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So I'll back up and say, I think many of us learned languages in situations where the first language, so let's just use English for the sake of this discussion, since that's a lot of times in the US, that's the first language, seeing that as just the total enemy. Like, this is going to be the biggest impediment to you. Don't you dare speak a word of English, or, that kind of a thing in the classroom. And to some degree, I think communicative language teaching may encourage that approach. Is just jettisoning, all of what you bring to the table. And I think in many cases, there are many different types and paradigms for bilingual education, but often, and, especially recently with the work of people like Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei, the idea is let's let you bring your whole self to this endeavor and take the resources that you have and try to work with them rather than asking you to suppress them, turn them off, leave them behind. So this ties in kind of with a transition away from more of a monolingual type of ideology. So this would say something like, okay, Brooke, you're in my French class and your goal is to act like and mimic a monolingual French speaker. I think that has been sort of our viewpoint for a long time in the field. And I think what we're seeing now is Brooke is not going to be a monolingual French speaker. And that's
Mm.
actually great because you're yourself. And so what you're going to be is a bilingual speaker. And so what we need to do is give you resources to support the way that bilinguals use language.
Mhm.
Now, I don't mean this to say that, it's a bad thing to try and create an immersion environment or to encourage students to express themselves in whatever the language of instruction is, but rather to maybe so you asked kind of what people are talking about or what's kind of hot right now, and that would be, it's a little bit controversial too, I think, maybe, is this idea of translanguaging, which is that you can use a multilingual repertoire to become a multilingual speaker. And so rather than thinking of this is language A, this is language B, and you're going to use one of them or you're going to alternate between them, like in a code switching model, you have multiple different resources and it's all in kind of a unified repertoire. You can pull from that based on what you need at the time. So therefore, language learning becomes about increasing, expanding your repertoire, rather than acquiring another bucket that you can kind of hop between. So.
Okay. So would that mean like more permission to, I'm trying to communicate in French, but there's like some element of what I'm trying to communicate, but I don't know how to structure it, or I don't know the exact word in French, and being the permission to fill in with English to communicate my point, and that being okay, and not a demotion in my grade or what have you.
It may look that way. Yes. And
Okay.
I think there's also the understanding that won't always work. So
right.
it's very, I think it forces you to be very attentive to the conversational context. So while it will work in your classroom, it may not work on, the streets of Marseille.
Yeah.
So and so you have to be able to recognize that. But if it will encourage you to speak more in class and encourage you to go further toward expanding that repertoire, and feeling more like, there are parts of yourself that are useful, or at least not, because I think all of us are sort of familiar with the phenomenon of, okay, well, this is an immersion class and I can't speak English, so I guess I'm just not going to say anything because I don't want to make a mistake and I don't want to look silly. So yeah.
It's so interesting. So this is kind of going off our questions a little bit, but I'm working with a student who's going to be enrolling in a immersive language program in France this summer, and talking with the program director in France about their approach and looking at the syllabi. And we're doing all the things for credit transfer, all the things you're supposed to do and study abroad. But it's very interesting. The approach that they take at this particular institution is like immersion. Everything is communicated in the local language, in French, obviously. And it's sort of just like sink or swim. You're coming to France, you're going to speak French, even if it's not great. So I guess obviously that's a model that's still very prevalent. And like you mentioned, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have immersion components, but what would, I guess, the naysayers say about this move in this direction towards this bilingual, multilingual turn, as you called it? What's their sort of pushback to this model?
Yeah, so there may be a lot of different answers to that question, and maybe somebody in the audience may have, may feel some strong feelings. I think one big one is one I hear a lot, for example, is the kind of the slippery slope argument. So like, where does it end? If you're going to let in resources from another language, then guess what? By the end of, 45 minutes, there might not even be speaking French anymore. And the other one would be something like, well, that's all well, and we kind of touched on it earlier, which is it's all well and good in an instructional setting, but how's that going to fly for you if you do go abroad, for example. But like you mentioned at the top, the models for study abroad are changing, and they aren't always as language focused as they traditionally have been. So at a place like Carnegie Mellon, a lot of students are aware that if they are going to pursue kind of an internationally focused STEM career, English will be a lingua franca for them, and they will be able to sort of operate primarily in English. But I think something that's very inspiring to me is the kind of, with the newer models you were mentioning, is the kind of interdisciplinary nature of it. So, you mentioned service learning, you mentioned internships. I think these are things that are very attractive to students at the moment. And I know that, you know, in our department, we're working on creating new study abroad programs in places like Costa Rica and places like Jordan that follow some of those models and are able to attract students with a diverse area of interest that may or may not speak some Spanish or some Arabic or whatever the language may be, but could learn some or could sort of customize how much of a language focus they want to have. So I think students are looking to get multiple different, they always have been, but I think in new ways, they're looking to get multiple different experiences out of a study abroad program.
Right. Well, and I think it's also interesting. I mean, we're seeing this in other areas where, and you know, coming from Carnegie Mellon, I think this will be maybe even interesting to you, is that when we think about, you know, the skill set of sort of the modern economy and high demand career paths and things like that. So I think like data analytics is just like a hot thing in almost any industry in any field right now. But oftentimes universities, the way they structure the curriculum around data analytics is that by the time you get to like the understanding the strategy and implementation of data analytics, you've got to go through like Calc 1, Calc 2, like all these sort of I don't know, vetting even, or maybe foundational, but they definitely weed out some students to then get it to the practical functional application of the subject matter. And I think something kind of happens in language as well. And so to finish that thought, that there are organizations now who are like, okay, how do we get people the nuts and bolts of what data analytics is, some understanding of how to implement it but bypassing the scary Calc 1, Calc 2, what have you. And so I think in language, it is kind of similar, at least in my experience. I'd love to know from the audience too, especially those who are not very skilled at language learning, is that it was very intimidating because I felt like I had to be a scholar of French as opposed to somebody who needed a functional ability to at least communicate and grow from that place. So it sounds like maybe this bilingual multilingual turn thing would have been very helpful to someone in my position. But do you see the education moving more and like, okay, how do we understand a student who's going to become a PhD in this, you know, or that track versus someone who's like, I really just want to know how to function and communicate in Japanese and use language to understand the culture a little bit better, but I'm not going to be a scholar of Japanese culture, history, language, et cetera.
Yes, I agree that there have been and continue to be in many cases some barriers to that because things have been set up for those who would like to be, you know, a scholar of literature or so it's powerful. I think earlier in your comment you mentioned shifting to see yourself as an emerging bilingual rather than needing to meet some sort of imaginary very high threshold in order to study abroad or to even continue taking language classes. And whereas if you see yourself as an emerging bilingual, maybe that threshold becomes lower and you feel like, okay, well, I can, because, you know, we know that things like having tolerance for ambiguity, having resilience and the ability to just keep trying, these are predictors of, you know, gaining good proficiency in a language, but they aren't necessarily skills that I think some of my colleagues certainly do emphasize these or talk about them in class, but maybe traditionally it hasn't been done. It's been more, you know, focused really on acquiring things like vocabulary, grammar, even some sort of language culture combination skills. And then the idea that you can then, that makes you into a speaker when this whole set of kind of negotiation that happens in a conversations and it's a developmental process, right? So seeing it as a lifelong developmental process, you know, might be helpful for students. I hope that is where we're headed. I think so. I think but you know, change can be slow. And I think also because you also mentioned earlier that there is some amount of decline in interest or enrollment in language courses. And so I think my colleagues and I are in the field are thinking of ways that we can better accommodate the type of students you're talking about who may not necessarily want to, you know, devote themselves to writing literary criticism, but or may not want to be linguists or may not see themselves attaining the highest level on the ACTFL scale, but have a certain amount of interest in a culture and would like to learn about the language, would like to learn to be conversational, or
Mhm.
maybe who have family members who speak a language, and they'd like to recover some of it, use it as a pathway into finding out more about
Mhm.
themselves and their families.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Mhm. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for mentioning in the chat. I'm just going to go for some of the responses we got because I found it quite
Mhm.
fascinating how many people here. I mean, maybe it's a self-selected group, but I'm like, all these people
Mhm.
speak a lot of languages, or at least tried, and or are bilingual. So I think that's really interesting. The diversity of language skills and knowledge here in our virtual room, which I think is really an amazing. We've got Anne Lambright, I thought was really interesting. She's fully bilingual, English and Spanish, working knowledge of Portuguese, French, and Quechua. Wow. And elementary Italian and Chickasaw. And I hope I said all those correctly, but that is amazing. And I must be like, Anne must, and if you're still here and you want to share in the chat, you must love languages, or your life experience like really exposed you to quite a different diversity of languages that made you even more interested, or gave you kind of a running head start as a young, like a child, maybe. I just find it fascinating. Jeremy Geller, kind of like me, studied 5 languages, barely functional in one, plus your native. Yeah, Jeremy and I are like a kindred spirit over here. Love that. Sandira, sorry, Smith said she's a heritage speaker of Spanish, Japanese, and Croatian. She's revisiting. Amazing. Carrie Geffert, rusty multilingualist. Yes. So this is, Anne says it's been her passion. So yeah, we need the Anns of the world. So thank you. Thank you all for sharing. And if you have questions for Katie, please share them in the chat. I have one more question for her before we wrap up, and then I'll turn it over to you all as well. And so I guess I feel like it's 2022. We can't talk about language learning if we don't talk about language apps and all these other tools outside of traditional higher ed or education in general that are enabling people to learn languages. And this is not new in 2022. Obviously, we've had Rosetta Stone and our little discs and things for several decades now. But I think now more than ever, the opportunity to dive into a language without any kind of gatekeeping, without tuition, without even a direct teacher is more available than ever. And I'm curious, like, especially in the academic realm, as you discuss with your colleagues, language acquisition, what do you see the role of these apps? Do you love them? Do you hate them? Do you think that we should be utilizing them in higher ed more or less? I'm not sure. Give me your take. What's your hot take on
Oh,
technology? Yeah.
yeah. So you're right in the sense that we're seeing more than ever, and they are giving opportunities to their democratization, I think, and like a
Mhm.
less of a less gatekeeping, as I think you put it. So I think that's all really exciting. There's also a lot being done in the research world on, language technologies, machine learning, but also for instructional purposes, using things like virtual reality, and work being done by my colleagues. That's not my particular area of expertise
Mhm.
necessarily. I think the temptation for many of us who've been in the field for a while is to be a little skeptical. But I think whatever we can do to embrace them and to bring them into, I guess, kind of part of a complete breakfast, as my son likes to say, a late 20th century commercial reference
Oh, yeah.
to cereal. But the idea that they have, different ones have a lot of different strengths and can be wonderful tools and supplements for students, and can give opportunities to those who may not live in a place where a particular language is available. Maybe their language courses were cut in their school, for example. Somebody may want to learn a heritage language, but there's no one really around them that speaks it, or no opportunity for that. As you said, finances can also be a barrier, or time. So
Mhm.
when we think about our own students, I would never discourage my students necessarily from using the apps. I would just encourage them to think of it as part of a picture. So we don't want students to feel like, an app can be a replacement for something like going abroad, something
Mhm.
like having a group of like-minded people who want to practice together, because of, all of what we've been talking about is all about, language learning as social negotiation. And so my personal opinion is that if you don't have an interlocutor, a human interlocutor, it will only take you so far.
Yeah.
But that isn't to say that I don't, I definitely don't hate them. I'm very impressed by them, and I know they're going to continue to get better and better. So
Hmm.
um, I think they are a tool and a complement to
Hmm.
what we can offer, and I think they probably also make the experience of study abroad less isolating
Hmm.
in the ability to stay in contact. I also don't want to forget to mention the wonderful possibilities of social media for connecting with speakers of a language you're interested in, for learning about
Hmm.
the culture and the ways that people use language in everyday sort of spoken or written ways. So things like TikTok and Twitter and all of the social
Hmm.
media platforms can be excellent tools for those who really have a passion, but just don't have much access to
Hmm.
speakers or who maybe are abroad or can't go abroad. So I think that's also really wonderful. And there's a lot of
Hmm.
wonderful work by many of my colleagues coming out about the affordances for mobile technologies for learning languages.
Well, it sounds like you just teed up a future episode to bring some of your colleagues on here to talk
Great.
about the tech side of this, because I think that would be
Yes.
super fascinating. This has been wonderful too. I
Mhm.
think I taught English in China for a year. I feel like it's like an old trope at this point, but I remember even this would have been in 2007. Even back then, it wasn't that long ago, but feels technology wise generations ago. But I was teaching grammar, but I was also teaching I'd had lessons on speaking, and we'd have like these dialogue lessons. And I really hated teaching the grammar. For one, it just wasn't as fun.
Mhm.
And just thinking the idea of like, oh, how could we supplement like the engaging, and you talk about the human component that is really hard to replace in an app format, if you will.
Mhm.
And how can you do the stuff that's like the kind of the nuts and bolts grammar component that maybe, and there's probably people out there who are like, I love teaching grammar, but I'm not that person. But like taking the part where it's like, okay, they could do that through some app with some lessons and some integrated, back and forth with an app interface, but then taking the speaking and listening and communicate, like the active
Mhm.
communication of implementation of those rules, and utilizing, I think they could, a human component with the faculty or the teacher, that could be an interesting marriage. I'm sure there's lots of research, and I'm probably very old, late to that game, but that seems like there's some really exciting possibilities there.
Yes, well, using them as part of a flipped classroom, right? And then
Right.
maximizing class time for more kind of synchronous practice or
Yeah.
face-to-face
Yeah.
interaction,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, we do have a question from the audience. So thank you,
Okay.
Angelo Pisano, for asking your question. And they say, how do you validate the heritage seeker experience in the classroom? Really great question.
Ooh, it is a great question. And then I don't think it's an easy thing. I think so my experience is that many heritage speakers come with a lot of internalized feelings, maybe some shame, not everyone, but many do come with some shame around how they speak. So it's a complicated issue. It's delicate. I
Uh,
think,
Can I just, before you go
sure.
further, can I just ask
Yes.
maybe, and I just thought of this, like for the broader audience who may not know
Mhm,
the difference between like a heritage speaker or a bilingual speaker, how do you
mhm.
define heritage speaker?
Sure, of course. So, like many things, there isn't necessarily one agreed upon definition, but most of the time
Right.
people think of heritage speakers as those who grew up hearing or speaking a language that is not the sort of dominant language spoken in society. So an example
Okay.
might be if you come from a family that speaks Spanish and you're in the United States, parts of the United States have a lot of Spanish speakers, but it's not the sort of wider language. There are nuances to that, but that's the basics. So usually
Mhm.
it's some kind of family or community connection at an early age. And because of the way many schools in the United States work, some are very fortunate and go to bilingual education right away. And so they kind of grow up mastering multiple languages. Others don't. And so, both could potentially be considered heritage speakers, but I think when they arrive at the kind of the university level and they are heritage speakers, they may have come as a childhood immigrant. So like I said, there's a lot of different ways you end up in a
Mhm.
class for heritage speakers. I think maybe what Angela is getting at is the idea that one of the challenges is that students come in at all different levels with all different types of exposure to whatever the language is. And you want them to feel good about that while at the same time expanding what they know.
Mhm.
And so sometimes what comes into clash is the kind of formal. There are lots of words for it. We could call it formal, we could call it academic, we could call it standard, we could call it proper. And whatever you're thinking of, you have an image in your head of what that looks like for a
Mhm.
language. And so that can sometimes come into conflict with what students already know. And so it's very hard
Mhm.
to keep two things that are equal but different. It's hard to keep them on an equal playing field. And a lot of teachers really try their best, but do end up, kind of correcting students or saying, no, you don't really say it like that. And so the challenge is I think his question is, how do you validate what
Mhm.
students come with while at the same time expanding what they know, but not leading them to believe that what you're teaching them is better in any way than what they already know.
Mhm.
So some of my work focuses on that. It's tough, Angelo. I think one way that participants in some groups that I've conducted, focus groups for instructors that teach heritage speakers, have done is to really try to bring some sociolinguistic knowledge to the students. So just sort of laying all of what I just said out for them and saying, you know, every language has forms that are kind of uplifted and forms that are stigmatized. And why is that? What are the kind of socio-historical, political forces at play? And how can we learn more about that? And then how can you choose for yourself what types or what, and this is true for, I think, L2 learners as well. At a certain point, we'll have to make choices. What
Mhm.
variety of this language do we want to speak at what time? And
Mhm.
so this is why the concept of a repertoire can be very useful. You have a lot of resources at your disposal. If we can take a critical eye to what's going on here and you can expand your resources, maybe you can, because it's not always the case that the most formal variety of a language is the most appropriate for every situation. You
Mhm.
could end up, sounding like a real jerk if all you're doing is going for the highest possible formality in every situation.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Well,
so
go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that that's one sort of piece of it. There is so much more, of course, to say. I know we don't necessarily have time for it, but it's a wonderful
Yeah.
question,
Yeah. Yeah.
an
Great.
important
Thank you.
one.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here as part of this conversation. And mostly thank you, Katie, for being here as our resident expert on all things language acquisition. And I can't wait to have you and your colleagues back on a future episode to talk more, maybe in depth about the technology thing or component of all of this. And thank you to the audience. And I want to absolutely thank the Spanish Institute for Global Education in Sevilla, Spain for sponsoring this episode. If you'd love to learn more about them, go to SpanishInstitute.net. And of course, we will link up to Katie's LinkedIn and you can connect with her if you have further questions over on that platform as well. So thank you so much, Katie. It was wonderful to meet you. I hope you have a wonderful summer and thank you to the audience. Have a wonderful, wonderful month.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Brooke.